So, without further delay, I think there's something a bit ironical in the title of the book, and especially me in the heart of Manhattan telling you how to make money. So let me break the news right now. If you really want how to make money, you don't need to read my book. But if you do have an interest in ways Romans conceived of different occupations, I do hope that the book can provide like a way in thinking about this. As I put together my presentations, I thought, in 30 minutes or so, I'm not going to give you a summary of the book. So I'm not going like in order like chapter to chapter and from cover to cover. Rather, I would like to give you some suggestions about different ways the book can be read. That is, like to tease out some of the main streams that make up the main texture of the book. And so, what I would like to do first is to talk about the gap. And by the gap, I mean the incredible difference that in the Roman psyche, in the Roman mindset, there was between respectability and profitability. That is, the main jobs that would pay really, really well were not necessarily the most respectable, and vice versa. So I want to lead you into this and use this as a sort of an inroad into the Roman understanding of works, jobs, and how to make money. Then I want to talk a little bit about the evolution, and especially to keep like a sort of triangular conversation between the Roman people, how they spent their life, what did they do for living day after day, Roman history, and the evolution of this exciting story of Rome growing from a teeny-meeny, insignificant city-state into a world empire. And, of course, very much intertwined with this, the economy. So how this growth influenced the economy and how, in turn, this impacted the life of millions of individuals. The last 2 points that I want to make could kind of fall under the same title. One is basically the Romans and us. One of the great feedbacks that I really enjoyed after this book is that I had some people say, wow, the Romans were just like us. And other people say, wow, I would never have thought that the Romans ... And to me, this is very exciting because I think it's exactly the way it should be. So in so many ways, you may find the Romans as really our ancestors. In so many other ways, you may feel like the jolt that you feel when you encounter a different civilization in its own terms. The series that this book came out for Princeton is typically a collection of one or more texts which are presented in the original, so you will have the Greek or the Latin on the one side of the page, and the translation with an introduction. So my idea is kind of to help this text to talk for themselves and kind of lead through this. The last point after the Romans and us is about sort of what we could call a cross-section of Roman society. It's very easy, and it's been done for a long time, like to focus on the big ones of history, the famous ones, the powerful, and so forth. And it's very easy to maybe put aside the rest of us, who go through making a living again, day in, day out, in the daily routine of grinding work, which is apparently insignificant. Part of the problem here is also the nature of the evidence. We know so much about so very few people and so little, and let's be honest, sometimes absolutely nothing about the great, great majority of the other people. So in thinking and conceiving this book, I wanted as much as I could to keep this great, great majority of the forgotten, so to speak, little people in the picture. And that's why, aside from using some literary text and evidence, I also tried to take a look, when I could, to inscriptions and try to chase and follow the life of those who easily fell on the margins and got forgotten. So to start, the gap. Perhaps this is the most evident sort of trend in the book. And if you just read the table of contents, it goes from the most productive, lucrative, and popular occupations, which for the Romans were farmers, was farming, to another very productive but least respected occupation. So in a way, you could read the book as the story of this widening gap between these two lines. As I said at the start, most respectable and most lucrative did not always go together for the Romans. I have no time to go from chapter to chapter, good news, but I want to give you like a snapshot of the end, which is the point where this gap is the widest. And I want briefly to talk about human trafficking and this human exploitation of human beings very much from the Roman perspective. This is where the gap is particularly evident. Very lucrative and quite despised and looked down at, yet totally legal. So I want to give you like a snapshot of chapter 6 and talk briefly about the deployment of prostitution and then of human trafficking. I apologize for the uncheerful topics, it got a little better. So Romans had a strong despised and a sort of discontent with all those in their formulation made a living by their body, corpore quaestum facere. Made a living by their body literally meant to put your body in display for an occupation. Under this broad and a bit like fuzzy category fell a lot of different occupations, including prostitution, the entire business, both the pimps and the prostitute themselves, human trafficking, but also, for example, gladiators. They entertain people with their body. They could be incredibly wealthy and incredibly popular, and yet there was a mark of infamia, this sort of almost official mark of contempt. Another category, of course, were actors, because as all the others for the Romans, they made a living by using their body. So these people were typically marked with infamia. Infamia is Latin for sort of a bad fame, an ill reputation, which was almost impossible to shake off. Even if you are practicing any of the I just mentioned occupations for a while, and then you stopped, still infamia will stay with you. Infamia was generally a moral stigma and a social stigma, but also it had some legal traits. For example, if you were ever branded by infamia because you were dealing gladiators or being an actor or renting prostitutes and so forth, I'm talking from a Roman perspective, you could not become an official priest or priestess. You could not stand for public office. You could not give witness in public trials and so forth. So there was a social but also a legal and practical mark to this infamia. I will focus for a moment on slave dealers and on prostitutes. So two of the different categories that fell under those who would make a living by their body. This is a map of the Mediterranean Sea, of course, and I ask you to take a quick look at the different islands between Greece and modern-day Turkey or Asia Minor. One of such islands was the island of Delos. And the island of Delos, in the first half of the 2nd century, became the main harbor for massive importation and selling of slaves. And this is what it would look like. For a long time, archaeologists didn't quite know what to make of this big building, but then they realized that it was clearly the slave market. What you see is a big enclave with a nice colonnade and open space in the middle, and then the traces of different rooms and the pedestals for towers, which were clearly used for soldiers to guard and to enclose at night those who were imported. I spare you the discussion by archaeologists. It's quite clear that this was indeed a slave market. And this is what happened. This is by an ancient geographer, Strabo, who writes a big description of different parts of the Mediterranean, and when he gets to Delos, says, "Ha! Delos, slave market." And this is how it worked. He insists on two things, which is precisely my point. Dealing slaves was incredibly easy and lucrative. In fact, we know that hundreds of thousands of slaves were brought to Delos and then sold to smaller dealers and then exported in different parts of the empire to be sold like in a sort of retail sale. So it was very profitable and very easy. And the market was such, and the need was such, that traders knew they did not to wait for long. In fact, Strabo says there was a saying, "Trader, dock here, unload, and your cargo's already been sold." Archaeology has shown that this is not an overstatement. Sometime in the middle of the 2nd century, the harbor was renewed, the docks of the different parts were made bigger and more magnificent, the houses became bigger, so there was wealth and money coming in, and this building was reinforced and enlarged. What happened there? What happened there is that big cargoes would arrive, slaves, very often chained, would just be brought in. The center, the open center under the sky, is where they would be sold. And we do not have a single description of what happened there from the perspective of one of these enslaved individuals. So we can use and try to use comparative evidence and what we know, like putting the pieces together. This is what we know. There was a small platform, which was called catasta, where a slave would stand up. And very often they were almost naked, and in standing up, they would have a sign around their neck with their name, their age, and some of the characteristics. Buyers would come. They would talk to the slave. They would touch them. They would look into their mouth. Sometimes they could actually even ask them to run a lap to see if they were healthy. And then there were other different signs. At the end, if they liked it, they would buy the merchandise, which is, of course, the slave. There is a moving piece of comparative evidence, which I bring in the book sort of to fill the gap, because as I said, we don't have the perspective of what happened there from the perspective of a narrative from the perspective of the slave. And this is Oldaia Equiano, who lived in the second half of the 18th century. And this is what he tells us about his experience as an enslaved individual on the market. We were not many days in the merchant's custody before we were sold in the usual manner. This part of the problem, it was the usual manner, so they don't tell us because they take it for granted. But he does. Which is this: on a signal given, such as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make choice of that parcel that they like the best. The noise and the clamor with which this is attended and the eagerness visible in the countenance of the buyers serve no little to increase the apprehension of the terrified Africans. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated, most of them never to see each other again. I repeat, this is not ancient evidence, but this fits perfectly. And this is what must have happened this time and again for hundreds of thousands of human beings who have been enslaved. Conclusion: I remember in the vessel in which I was brought over, in the men's apartment there were several brothers who in the sale were sold in different lots. And it was very moving on this occasion to see and hear their cries at parting. So you can see, in a way, why slavery being legal, this was an incredibly lucrative business, but on the other hand, why this was marked with infamia, which in a way it's also a bit, I believe, hypocritical of the Romans, to allow it and to despise it at the same time. The other situation where this gap is particularly visible, I think the widest in the Roman mind and economy, is of course prostitution. So this is the inside of a brothel in Pompeii, and what you see, you can already guess. So you have a lot of frescoes, actually pornographic, with scenes of sex above, and also the one they reconstructed in the middle. Quite small cellars, which is where the girls would receive their clients. The reason why you don't have anything written on the top, on the rim of the door, is that would typically carry, and we know from comparison with other brothels, the name typically of the girl. They also had boys, but the name of the girl and the price. Prostitution was legal, and the state got a tax, which was part of the money that was spent for each encounter. Therefore, being legal, the Romans, with their legal mindset, had to define very clearly what prostitution is and what it is not. And this is what they said. What is prostitution? It does not depend on the place where the act is consumed. It can be in a brothel, it can be somewhere else. That is not the point. Moreover, for the Romans, prostitution does not depend strictly on exchanging money for sex. And they make this very clear. That is not what makes a prostitute. What makes a prostitute is the inability to discriminate. So if someone comes with money, that's the service you are giving. You have no power to say, no, I don't want it. I will not sleep with you, and so forth. This is what marks prostitution. Once again, and I want to highlight this hypocritical kind of disconnect between something which was legal, which was practiced, and which was despised at the same time. So the Romans and the law added, procuring prostitutes is no less severe than selling oneself. Infamia. It comes with a ill name, but they did not even try or think about trying to change anything. By procurers, we indicate women who prostitute other women for profit. So both prostitutes and pimps would be marked by the same level of infamia. So this is, to me, the widest point of the gap between lucrative and respectable occupations. And this is why many Romans did this, but they were marked with what we called infamia. Moving on to hopefully more cheerful topics in the Roman economy, we can talk briefly about the evolution. How did things change over the course of the Roman history? I don't follow things chronologically, but in the book I try to keep an eye to this change, and I try to ask always, how did the making of the empire affect the economy and the life of people? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First off, I like to have this clear when I teach my students. For a long time, I would say centuries, the Roman economy, the great Roman Empire economy, was spectacularly backward. It was totally based on exchange and very, very rural. This backwardness has left a lot of marks in the Latin language and via French in the English language. For example, as probably you know, money, the English, comes from moneta. Moneta originally meant coin, but not necessarily. It also meant generally money, broadly. Why moneta? What's the connection between coin and money and moneta? Simply because, and this is the best explanation, the mint for the Romans was next to a temple of Juno, Moneta. So for the Romans, for a long time, money was that thing that is produced next to that temple up there in downtown Rome. And this was because they would use for so many transactions actually exchanging goods, including metals and especially cattle. Once again, this has left traces, this backward economy has left traces in English. Pecuniary, it's a word that we use. It comes from pecunia, which is Latin for money, which comes from pecus, which means cattle or sheep. Read, for a long time, money was cattle. And the means to acquire something was to exchange a certain number of sheep or cattle, generally. The other, stipend, another clear word of the economy, originally means stips and pendo. Pendere is the act of weighting something. And stips is like a material that you weight. So a stipend was how much material you get for your service. Once again, a very, very primitive economy. Remuneration comes from the Latin word munus, and munus is one of the two ways to talk about gift. Donum is a gift that doesn't expect anything in return, while munus is sort of an exchange. Interesting. Same word as communication. Communication is literally like an exchange of gifts. I tell my students, if everybody kept this in mind before opening their mouth, we'll probably live in a better world. But this is the idea of remuneration. So I give you a gift in return for your service. And then other words, including Felix and Laetitia. Laetitia actually comes from manure. And that meant happiness. Well, if you are a farmer, there's nothing happier and more fertile than a well-manured field. What I would like to talk about here in talking about this evolution is the evolution in the Roman system of taxation, which once again was, let me say, spectacularly backward. So this is a map of the Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century, at the time of the Second Punic War, which is recognized by most scholars as a real turning point in the Roman economy. Apparently, it's almost sure that this is a time when Rome started seriously minting coins simply because they had too many soldiers to pay for their service and they ran short of cattle and sheep, so they had to start minting coins. And it's also the time when the Romans acquired the first 2 overseas provinces, which you see in the center, which is Sardinia and Corsica. They devised this system of taxation, which you will see right away was just really not a good idea. Basically, they had companies of quite capable businessmen called publicani. And these publicani would join sources and resources and pool together as teams to bet on big public contracts. You want to construct a big road, a bridge, a new temple. Do you need to feed the soldiers who are serving in southern Spain, and so forth? So they had the infrastructure and the great number of people working for them. They were very organized. So they had a sort of manceps, which was kind of like the CEO. Then they had the soci. Everybody who invested in a specific society became a socius. And then they're like a sort of a council of administrators, like the leaders who were called the magistri. And these were elected for certain terms, depending on the society. You can make up your own rules for a certain specific number of years. And then some of these corporations were present in different parts of the empire. Therefore, they are also pro-magistri, which means people serving instead of the magister. So imagine if the headquarters is in Manhattan, then there could be different branches, and each one led by a magister. And then, of course, there are hundreds of people working in their staff. Some were free and some were enslaved. And they were working, doing a lot of different things. Once Rome made Sardinia and Corsica and Sicily provinces, they had the problem of taxing them. How do you go about collecting taxes? And basically, they just recycled a system that they already had in use for a lot of public works. So they had a bid. Whichever company offered the higher amount to collect taxes in a province won the bid. It sounds very logical unless you are one of the provincials, because of course, then the company is trying to make back the money they invested and to squeeze as much as they could out of these people. This system, which is terrible, even on paper, lasted for centuries until the Romans realized that they just couldn't do it anymore. Governors were officially sent out from Rome at the big problem of compromising. Should I try to keep the publicani in check and listen to the cry of the people, or give them like free rein and just dismiss the cry of the people who are being squeezed to death? I want to tell you briefly the story of a spectacular fraud attempted by the publicani. And then I will see how the story ends. 212, middle of the Second Punic War. Things are not going well. There is a serious chance by now that actually the Romans may lose not battles, but the entire war. So the situation they're feeling around is crisis. In the middle of this crisis, two individuals, one was clearly the Manceps and the other must have been one of the two magistri, called Pomponius and Postumius. Roman names seem meant to confuse students in quizzes, and they also father, children, all the same name, decided to came up with this idea. They won a bid for bringing food and materials and weapons to the Roman armies and soldiers who were serving overseas. But since by Roman law, if a cargo is lost because of a tempest, that is not the fault of the bidder, and the state would cover for the expense. Guess what they did? They got a bunch of old beaten up ships. They loaded them with cheap or actually no cargo at all, and they sunk them. And then they filed for refund from the state. Apparently, the rumor went out, and the issue was brought to the Senate, and the people were clearly disgusted. What, in the middle of the war, when everyone is making this incredible sacrifice to just come up with this scheme? The Senate, however, decided not to pursue the inquiry. This is not necessarily cynical. They must have realized that a scandal like this, especially if it turned out to be true, would have been too much, and they felt the need to keep united. So they tried to turn a blind eye, and maybe we'll deal with this later if we survive. But the rumor was out and was brought to the attention of the people. And the Roman people were not happy about that. So they called an assembly, and they decided to try to bring the people to justice and to try them. By Roman law, trials which were not about murder would be tried, but the entire assembly of the people divided in tribes. So they brought in the two people incriminated, our Postumius and Pomponius, and this is the way the assembly would work. First, they would start, good Romans, with a prayer to the gods. And after the prayer, the issue, the agenda, would be presented to the people. In this one case, the people already knew, and they were pissed, forgive my French. Third, there was room for the witnesses to come in. How do you know that they actually sunk the ships? What did you see, and so forth? And then was room for some discussion and different proposals and so forth. After this, there was the moment when they actually came up with a motion. And in this case, the motion was, we want to bring to justice these two people because of what they did. The last chance for a tribune of the plebs to veto and interrupt the assembly was the moment when a big urn was brought in, which is what was used for voting. So the tribes would cast their one vote, one per tribe, into this big urn. The Roman legalistic mind had a clear endpoint. After this, when we start casting votes, the assembly cannot be interrupted anymore. So the publicani now were really concerned. This is not going well. And Roman assemblies were quite loud, and people would cheer and clap and shout and so forth. It was clear that it was going to be condemned. And they realized that the only card they could possibly try was to hope that Servilius, who was a relative of Pomponius, one of the two incriminated, and was also a tribune of the plebs, would use his power of a tribune to stop the assembly. So you have to imagine the urn is coming in, the clock is getting close to the end when you can no longer stop the assembly, and the publicani en masse trying to put pressure on Servilius to stop the assembly. And Servilius with his back against the wall. Should I let down my people, the publicani, or lose popularity for the rest of my life? I cannot interrupt this assembly. It's too clear where this is going. So he didn't have the courage to do this. And guess what happened next? The publicani closed ranks, formed a wedge, and physically started running and attacking the people. This would have been a riot. And there have been precedent even before of Roman assemblies ending with bloodshed were it not for one of the consuls. He literally threw himself physically between the publicani and the people, and using his authority as a consul, he said, "Stop, we cannot do this." He must have had a lot of authority because, believe it or not, they did stop. Assembly is dismissed and adjourned to the next time, and Fulvius, the consul, called right away for a meeting of the Senate. And now we're in the Senate, and there's a lot of publicani and their friends and their connections, like the powerful businessmen, and a lot of people who are simply disgusted or afraid of the pressure of the people. You get it. So what happens next? After Fulvius' intervention, senators argue in favor and against. Let's try not to talk about this now, or let's bring these tribunes, these publicani, to justice. They decided, actually, what is the verdict? This is the end of the story. The Carvili, who were the tribunes of the plebs, on the spot put aside a proposal of a fine and summoned Postumius to court for capital punishment. So this is a case when the pressure of the people, it was not always like this, was able to withstand the power of the publicani. And next, he was basically condemned to death, which means that he could leave before being executed, and he left and he went into exile. And so did the other people, the ones who supported him, the ones who supported his bid, and the ones who charged the people in the assembly. They were all exiled. So this was a fraud by the publicans, and then a shameless attempt to cover it up came to such an end. To me, this is a clear sign that things are changing. The compact village that had conquered central Italy and then Italy and started conquering the Mediterranean kind of was showing some serious cracks inside. And the power of the money that was coming in from the empire was clearly straining these relationships big time. So if I can borrow a sentence from Citgo, when we talk about conquering complexity, once again, the Romans were quite backward. I would say that they conquered land and an empire, and then it took them ages, centuries, to figure out how to deal with the complexity of the empire that they had acquired. The system of taxation is an example of this long conquer of this complexity that in a way they did not predict or expect. Very quickly, the Romans at us, were they like us, were they different from us? I would like briefly to talk about war and the way they would go about war. Like a few more minutes, point 3 and 4 are much faster. And these are other sections in the book that I'm not going to talk about. So once the Roman assembly, and no one else for them could decide that the Romans would go to war, once they decided that they would go to war, they found a general, typically was one of the consuls or the emperor in the empire or someone he appointed. And once they went to war, the general, whoever that was, had an incredible degree of discretionality. They could make very big, important choices. Are we going to fight today? Are we offering battle? Are we taking the offer of battle from the enemy? Are we waiting for more troops? Or better conditions for the terrain and so forth. Equally, if they did fight and they won a battle or a war, they had a lot of discretion in the way they would use or dispose of the cities, the people they conquered, and so forth. And this is an example of two very, very different generals. On your right, you have Julius Caesar, and on your left, you have Lucius Licinius Crassus. Julius Caesar, spectacular general, and incredibly lavishly generous. Crassus, quite stingy and very, very greedy, and actually not a very good general. From the point of view of the people, who you end up serving for could make an incredible difference. It's kind of like investing in stocks, which ones are going up and which ones are going down. Sometimes you don't really know until you do it, especially if you're like me. Now, this is the point of view of the people. This is a poem from a poet who was a contemporary, and he's poking fun at two people who, whoops, they invested in the wrong general, Crassus. Actually, this was yet another one, was Piso, but it's the same story. Followers of Piso, useless bunch with your fitting and light baggage, excellent Verranus, and you, my dear Fabulous, how are things? He kind of knew how things were. He's kind of, the very question is already ironic. It's like if you invest in bad stock and say, how's your investment? Well, you sort of know. And then says, did you spend more than you gained? So did I. I got fucked well and slowly. May the gods and goddesses punish you, shameful generals. So this gives you a perspective from the bottom of the ripple effect of good and generous generals versus not very good and greedy generals. Pay attention who you end up following. Another sign of the cracks of the empire. On the other hand, did you hear what happened to Mamurra? A useless guy. You will never guess. You will never give him a cent, but the lucky man got the right stocks. And this again is Catullus say, who can take this? Who can endure unless one is shameless, insatiable, or a gambler? What's annoying him so much? Mamurra now possesses the wealth that used to belong to Gaul and Britain. Shameless Romulus, will you put up with this? So this is kind of like the envy and disgust as someone who was not better than his good friends Favonius and Verranus, but just lucked out following a big general. Last, very briefly, I want to give you a sense, and this in the book, this is not a chapter or a separate section, but it's like peppered and sprinkled around the book of the rest, the more common people, the ones that we had to chase through inscriptions and so forth. And basically, I want to read you some inscriptions, and I think very much they talk by themselves. To be sure, and I think that it's well known, the Roman war sometimes is idealized. It was a terrible world. And Roman society was very sexist and hierarchical. It's undeniable. And yet, without justifying this for a second, and yet it was also way more open than any other pre-industrial society and any other society around the Mediterranean Sea. So, if you're lucky, and if you were capable, you could, this is not everyone's story, but you could climb up and maybe even start as an enslaved person and buy your own freedom and doing incredibly well. These are some of the descriptions that document this. It's not everyone's story. So if we talk about the more open society, I don't want to mislead you and forget about the two other characteristics of Roman society. So this is a former slave who did very well and worked very hard. And worked so hard that one year, it was a bad year of crops for everybody, but guess what? Fulvius Cresimus, camps and fields produced way more than anybody else's. People were jealous, and especially they could not quite explain how, under the same conditions, same weather, and so forth. And so they started accusing him of using dark magic. This was a Roman obsession. It goes back to the laws of the 12 tables, back down possibly to the 6th or 5th century BCE. And so they brought him to court. And they say, you cast a spell on the crops of all your neighbors. That's why you produced better. And this is what Crasimus did. He brought all the farming tools and his entire teams of slaves into the forum where the process was being held, the trial. They were healthy, well-tended, and well-dressed, with excellent iron tools, heavy plowshares, and strong oxen. And he said, gentlemen, this is my dark magic. And I cannot even show you by bringing into the forum the work I did in my sleepless nights and how much I sweated. What happens next? He was acquitted. So the charge of using black magic was dismissed, and the Romans really lifted their head and saluted the good work of this fellow Roman who came from slavery. I repeat, it's not necessarily everybody's story, but it was a society where this type of openness was possible. Another example, and here I read some epitaphs, which are tomb inscriptions. The vast majority of people do not have tomb inscriptions, and even those who had one, very often did not survive. So these are a very small sample. It has been calculated that a small inscription with maybe your name, your age, and profession would cost about 3 months of wage for poor laborers. So having an inscription itself is a sign of being already at a certain point in the pyramid of society. One epitaph is about rural slaves. The rural slaves dedicated this monument in inscription to Hippocrates, the supervisor of Plautus. He ruled over them mildly. You need to sort of read between lines. This is actually very moving. So this is fellow slaves using their money to bury and commemorate another slave. And why? Because it was their supervisor and he governed them mildly. This is another epitaph, and this is another type of business dedicated to Castus, the slave secretary of Lucius Volusius Saturninus. He was 22 years old. Tiphanaea, this sounds very much like the name of a slave, built this with her own money for her fellow slave, who well deserved it from her. Once again, you have a slave taking care and commemorating another fellow slave. This slave, and this is a female slave, must herself have been doing well if she was able to save up and build this. And this is the way she spent it. A couple more examples, and I'm choosing intentionally different type of jobs. So you saw the first was related to agriculture. This is a secretary. So this must have been clearly an educated slave who could read and write. Next, we're going to commerce, to the divine spirits of Abudia Megiste. This used to be a slave. Who dedicated this inscription? Most dutiful freedwoman of Marcus. The inscription is dedicated by Marcus Abudius Luminaris, her patron and likewise husband. He made this monument for her, a well-deserving dealer in grain and pulses at the middle stair. This is almost for local people. What the heck does the middle stair mean? We have no clue. But I assume that people in the neighborhood knew lovely Megiste and perhaps went shopping for groceries day after day for years, and she, starting out as a slave, did really well. What else can we gather from this information? Marcus Abudius Luminaris most likely was perhaps a slave himself. He has no filiation. He doesn't say son of such and such, so probably he came from a slave background. Then he became his owner, and then they married. And this was not an uncommon story. And sometimes, judging by the descriptions, there were very happy marriages. Slaves could not marry, so the fact that he calls it his wife means that before dying, he set her free, because slaves did not have legal marriage otherwise. The rest of the story, they built a monument. Look at this inscription is longer, which is more expensive, which is they really did well. So For he built this monument and inscription for himself and his freedmen and freedwomen and descendants, and for Marcus Abudius Saturninus, his son, fellow tradesman of the Esquiline tribe, of the body of elders who lived 8 years. Body of elders was clearly a title of honor, not based on age. He died when he was 8. So this is like a couple of slaves who did well, and perhaps they had a freeborn child whose life was cut short when he was 8. So I think these descriptions, I find them very, very moving. And I stop here. There's a lot of things I didn't talk about, so we can talk more about this in case there's room for questions. Oh, I went on for too long. Yes, sorry. Thank you.
All right, there is time for questions. If anyone has one, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned about the value in terms of social status of the work made with body, but what about the soldiers? They also work with the body.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Generally, soldiers or sort of like people who would use their hands for laboring were not falling under the same category because they were not using their body for pleasure or for display. And the idea was to serve their country. In fact, if you were a soldier, you would show with a lot of pride the scars in your chest, because that's like what you endure for the defense of the country. So you're absolutely right. So this idea of corpore quaestum facere is with your body for show or for pleasure, not in any other way. Thank you. Am I making sense? Yes. Perfect. Yes.
I think the modern way of addressing the gap between, let's say, expected returns and expected respectability would be to create a kind of limited liability company, right, to do the bad thing and somehow shield me from the reputational harm of it, right? And so I wondered, I know there's certain things like this, right? Some kind of juridical persons that you can set up in Rome. How effective are they at shielding like the owner from the reputational backsplash?
Very effective. So the modern way is not modern. It's actually very, very ancient. So for example, there was a law which said that for a long time, senators could not invest in any type of usury or lend money for profit. Not a problem. So many senators had a sort of very often a former slave, a libertus, and he would just put his name and face, and they would actually happily invest in these societies. So it was just a way around, which is exactly what you are describing. Or equally, commerce was considered very lucrative, but lower in dignity than agriculture, and they did exactly the same for companies of publicani and so forth. So publicani were typically Roman knights, which were not senators. But senators were as involved with commerce and money lending as many other people. So it's to have like a go-between who saves face and allows you to access the big revenues was absolutely common. Thank you.
Hi. Just in terms of what we would call white-collar workers today, for instance, I guess back then would be basically scribes, people who knew how to read and write, possibly teachers. Or what was their social position? And the other question I have is, historically, during the Middle Ages, for instance, interest on money was considered, forbidden by the Catholic Church and all of that. Does any of that, the roots of interest being bad, go back to Roman times, or is that something they concocted later on?
It's much more Christian. So for the Romans, the interest rates is outrageous. They could be up to 12% per year. But if you were lending money for the maritime loan, so-called, like for marine cargo expeditions, it could go up to 25%, and there were special laws for that. So lending money for interest was very common, very lucrative, and people could be ruthless in cashing in when it was due. As for our sort of mapping of white collars, blue collars, and so forth, I really appreciate your question, because for Romans it mapped completely differently. So there were jobs which were very respectable and very typically were done by enslaved individuals. Like typically, Roman doctors could make a lot of money, but typically they were former slaves or slaves. And they could make money and save on the side, and sometimes they decided to buy their own freedom, sometimes they just didn't even care. So they were similar for teachers. Same for the white-collar job, which was highly paid and respected for the Romans as it is for us, was lawyers. So lawyers were Romans, and very often they were the big shots pulling their weight to defend their clients. But typically doctors or teachers were very often slaves or former slaves. They were respected. So Caesar said, well, their work appeals to the mind, so I respect it. But there was like this completely different way to map the social universe of work and making money for the Romans. Yes, thank you.
In your research, did you come across, I guess in the 2x2 matrix of lucrativeness and respectability, any professions then in the Roman world and also now in the modern world that were lucrative and respectable?
Absolutely.
On the flip side of that, were there any jobs that you found that were distinctly not lucrative and distinctly not respectable?
Very good question. Lucrative and respectable. The short response is chapter 1, which is agriculture. So if you have a good estate and you know how to manage to make it produce, you can make a lot of money and you'll be very respected. Once you make a lot of money, you probably cannot help thinking that there's other ways to make yet more money, which is not as respected, like lending money or partaking in these companies of investment and so forth. But agriculture would be the most respectable and typically highly rewarded work for the Romans. And that goes back to what I was saying about pecunia, like cattle and so forth. So that was the origin of Roman society. Your second question was?
Like a 1B to that, or like a 1A. Is there a modern equivalent of agriculture? And then the second question was, what's not lucrative and not respectable?
Very good. Well, there's, I think it's chapter 4 or 5, which is people who pretty much on their own initiative almost privately recruited an army, went to war, and they lost. And some of them even died shamefully and losing everything. And actually, this is the story of Crassus, one of the two characters that I threw on the screen before. So this could be non-lucrative and non-respectable. Another example is, and I didn't talk about this, games and entertainment. You want to make a splash, and you want to hedge your bet for becoming a big politician, you need to become known and to make your name liked and known by the people, right? A good way would be to offer gladiatorial games. But watch out, because Romans are kind of connoisseurs, and if your games are not exciting or they don't meet the expectation, it would backfire. And that would be a way to waste a lot of money. Elephants, we've seen it before, come on. So the rule was really one up the predecessors, right? Or you need more, you need new ideas, naumachías, naval battles, people fighting in squadrons on horses, and so forth. It could backfire, though. There are a couple of examples. One of some shows, big shows, that was really long awaited by Pompey, and it just didn't go well. They brought in a lot of elephants, and for some reason, which is a mystery to me, Romans were pretty cruel. the people took the side of the elephants, and they felt terrible when the elephants got stabbed and killed in the amphitheater. The year after, Pompey stood up for elections and lost. Another example is in the empire. The rumor went around that there were games at Paideia, not far from Rome. And since games in Rome has been not very popular because the emperor Tiberius was not into games, big crowds flooded the theater, but the theater was not built properly. It was like in wood on a kind of shaky structure, and it collapsed, and many people died. So that's another way to spend a lot of money and lose popularity and pretty much everything. I didn't respond to the question about modern times intentionally. We can keep it for discussion afterwards.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, I hope you'll join me in thanking...
Sorry for going over time, Jason, and everyone. So, yeah.
Hey, no, time is money, no problem.
Thank you.